The fall of the British Empire is a 20th century story. The high point of the empire's strength and self-belief lies at the very start of the 20th century, at the limit of living memory, and at the very extent of our ability to see the past in moving images. No sooner had the empire reached its summit than the long decline began. Today, the empire lives on in myth and fiction, a bitter grievance for some, for others, a romantic dream. Long before flags were hauled down and new nations born, the British Empire had already fallen in the minds of men. World War I was a demon that devoured the empire's wealth, strength, and young men. A demon that gnawed the soul of the empire, eating away confidence and any belief that the empire was something worthwhile. In the interwar era, many knew Britain had no longer the absolute military strength to maintain its grip on that worldwide dominion, and many in Britain had no longer the will or desire to rule. All over the empire, the ruled were becoming aware of themselves. A new class of native leaders had been educated in British ideas of freedom and justice. These men articulated the desires of new mass political movements, movements based on the demand for freedom. World War II accelerated history. The world of 1945 could be scarcely imagined by the people of 1939. The war began with horsed cavalry and biplanes. 6 years later, fighting ended with jet fighters, ballistic missiles, and the bomb. The war shattered the imperial illusion. It's hard for us in the present to realize that subject peoples had thought the white European soldier an invincible Superman. World War II had seen Europeans outfought and humiliated by Asians. As white soldiers surrendered before the Japanese, the belief in any Superman, in European invincibility, disappeared. Japan had hidden its own imperial ambitions behind a deceit that it was the liberator of Asia from colonialism. Many British imperial subjects, soldiers of the Indian Army, went over to the Japanese cause. The Japanese Empire lied. It desired only to replace the British and other European powers. But the desire for independence that Japan unleashed created a history that could not be put into reverse, forming ideas that could not be unthought. The powers to which victorious Britain was allied were against the very idea of empire. The American population that welcomed the peace in 1945 believed the war had been fought to bring the rest of humanity the freedoms and rights that Americans held as self-evident truths. During the war, Winston Churchill had bitterly opposed America, who declared that it should be the right of all people to choose their own government. Churchill convinced himself that America did not mean Britain's empire. He was wrong. Much of America's war had been fought in the Pacific, with harsh and savage fighting against an unyielding and unrelenting Japanese. The lands over which America fought these battles were often parts of the British Empire, the Solomon Islands, Borneo, and New Guinea. The leaders of America and the millions of ordinary Americans instinctively rejected the idea of Americans dying to simply hand these territories back to the descendants of King George III. American business wanted to create a global free market and thought the British Empire a huge cartel, a racket to fix the market and freeze out US competition. However much Britain and America might bask in the victorious friendship of a special relationship, the hardest truth of the post-war world was that whatever British patriots might think, what America wanted and what America needed could not be ignored by Britain. America had emerged from the war a superpower, and Britain was mortgaged to American money. What America wanted, America would get. Hard-headed Americans saw that Britain's empire offered a network of ready-made bases to encircle and oppose the new enemy, Soviet Russia. The USSR had emerged from the war as the second world superpower, fundamentally opposed to imperialism and capitalism. Russia would support movements for independence everywhere in the world. Political support at the conference table matched with money and arms in jungle ambush and street fighting. America and Russia emerged from the war stronger, but Britain had been impossibly weakened, its industry smashed and exhausted, all wealth spent. The new socialist government that Britain elected in 1945 offered a weary people a fantasy, a bright new world sweeping away the past, of a welfare state that would take care of every need from cradle to grave. This was a Britain busy creating a national health service, nationalising mines and railways, building schools and universities. For Americans, that the die-hard imperialist Churchill was swept away in election defeat meant little. America feared the new government would create a socialist British Empire, shutting out American capitalism. In a very British way, in the style of a country that has no written constitution, no British government ever announced a decision to deliberately dissolve the empire. But in 1945, the funeral of the empire began, with the announcement that Britain would quit India. Immediately after the war's end, negotiators were dispatched from Britain. The British government of 1945 saw Indian independence as a moral duty and a pragmatic move for the good of impoverished Britain. The process that the British created to bring independence to India was to act as a model for the typically British way of ending empire. The British were always to aim for retreat in good order, always to do a deal with local leaders, often men they had imprisoned, always aiming to leave behind a freely elected government and the structures of democracy. The creation of a democratic self-governing India is a drama with a complex plot, peopled with towering characters and the passionate swirl of humanity that is the Indian people, as both actors and audience. In Delhi, in the very palaces of British power, the British politicians, colonial administrators and soldiers met with the new Indian elite. Many Indian leaders, even Gandhi, had been imprisoned during the war. Gandhi had called for the British to leave, even as the Japanese army stood on India's border. Britain had dispatched a mission offering India dominion status, to be the equal of Australia or New Zealand in the British family, if Gandhi would end his troublemaking. They were refused. The Indian and British leaders attempted to build a perfect state to govern the whole of India. They saw themselves as the high-minded, bold architects of a nation, drawing a new map and writing fundamental law. These were discussions that became a race against time, against the flow of history. In Indian city streets, in the smallest rural villages, Indian began to kill Indian. At the base level, the story of India's independence is a tale of surging emotions, of millions set afire with collective hysteria. For every high-minded statesman, there was a politician of the mob who would tap into the basest of human prejudices and threaten to immerse the subcontinent in savage civil war. Within India's armed forces, the enforcers of British rule, unrest began to grow. The Indian Navy mutinied at Bombay. British officers secretly warned they believed their men could not be trusted. Britain knew India could not be dominated by repressive force and resolved to leave as quickly as possible. At the heart of things was the problem of India's internal divisions, particularly the divide between Indian Muslim and Indian Hindu. The Indian Congress Party, led by Nehru and Gandhi, both British-trained lawyers, had led the demand for independence for a generation. Congress believed that India was an indivisible nation and looked to create a giant democracy. Congress was largely Hindu. Indian Muslims were represented by the Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. There had long been calls for India's Muslims to have their own state, for which a name had been invented: Pakistan. Many of the Indian princes wanted independence in their own right, as rulers of microstates. In 1946, the Constitutional Conference proposed the creation of a single giant Indian state, with an elaborate system of checks and balances, protecting the rights of individuals and of India's many ethnic and religious minorities. But when discussion moved from high-minded principle to letter of detail, How such a state could be made to work with ancient hatreds and mutual suspicion produced first stubborn deadlock and then mass street violence. Jinnah abandoned compromise and demanded Pakistan. His demands inflamed India. In the worst outbreaks of communal violence, 4,000 were killed in Calcutta and 1,000 murdered in Bombay. As the jewel in the British Empire's crown descended into anarchy, the Viceroy, overall Governor of India, wartime General Wavell, proposed that Britain evacuate India. The British government thought to abandon India would be a political disaster, and Wavell was dismissed. Britain wanted out, but wanted to leave behind a stable, democratic state. Wavell's successor, Lord Louis Mountbatten, the last Viceroy, has a controversial place in history. Mountbatten was a member of the British royal family, a fact which had in no way hindered his career in the British Navy. His real name was von Battenberg, changed to disguise his family's German origins. Mountbatten's nephew Philip would soon marry the heir to the imperial throne, Princess Elizabeth, a match Louis manoeuvred. Mountbatten served as wartime Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia. He had been a figurehead. Churchill had demanded a British commander over what was an American organised theatre of war. Mountbatten was pliable, happy to assume the grand but largely empty title. Mountbatten and his wife Edwina were glamorous and charismatic, what today we would call a celebrity couple. To some, Mountbatten was a statesman who would help forge a nation. To others, vain and arrogant, a man of style, but no substance, blind to all but his own career, who, as an automaton, followed orders from London to get Britain out as quickly as possible, and in doing so, would fail the people of India. Preliminary elections for an Indian parliament saw the country split along its fault lines of religion. Muslim areas overwhelmingly voted for Jinnah, the Muslim League, and Pakistan. Hindu regions for Congress and Nehru. Nehru accepted that India had to be divided. It is the tittle-tattle of history that as India was divided, Nehru and Edwina Mountbatten were having an affair. The British had ruled India for nearly 200 years. Under Mountbatten, that history unravelled in just a few months. Lines were drawn on maps in arbitrary and sweeping moves, dividing historic communities and placing minorities in peril. The Indian princes, who had pledged loyalty to the King Emperor for 2 centuries, was simply abandoned. India and Pakistan became nations at midnight on the 15th of August 1947. The sounds of celebration were almost immediately drowned out by violence and hatred, as those who found themselves on the wrong side of lines of partition became victims of ethnic violence, in which perhaps more than 500,000 were to die, and millions more become homeless refugees. The end of the Indian Empire, of the greatest and one of the oldest pieces in the imperial jigsaw, was followed quickly by the abandonment of one of Britain's newest and smallest colonies, Palestine. Palestine in 1945 had become a virtually ungovernable cauldron of violence. The territory had been given in trust to Britain after World War I. Many Britons saw the addition of the biblical Holy Land as the culmination of the British Empire. The God-fearing Protestant Empire believed the establishment of Christian government in Jerusalem after nearly 1,000 years of Muslim rule was divine reward for the good works of British civilization. The British in return had invested heavily in Palestine, making it the wealthiest and most sophisticated state in the Middle East, Palestine, though, was a space in which two desperately opposed peoples competed to make nations. Palestine was home to a large and growing Jewish population. This was a returning diaspora of Zionists, immigrants who sought to restore the Promised Land, and many were refugees from Nazism. The Zionists accused Britain of betrayal. They wanted to establish a national home for the Jewish people, promised by the British in 1917. Palestinian Arabs, led, as in India, by a sophisticated British-educated elite, thought Britain had broken promises also made in World War I to establish an Arab state free of foreign domination. The Arabs feared the influx of Jews and resented the immigrants. Palestine was tormented by mutual envy and suspicion. Sometimes Arab attacked Jew, sometimes Zionist attacked Arab. In the face of uncompromising terrorist opponents, the British, who by nature always tried to find a middle way, resorted to an uncharacteristic regime of violent repression. From 1936 to the outbreak of war, the Arab population had been in violent revolt. British troops had sat atop a boiling ferment of riot, bombing, and assassination. The immediate post-war years saw delegation after delegation of fair, well-intentioned, open-minded, decent British politicians make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They sought to meet everyone, to hear both sides, in the British way to see fair play. It is a sad historical fact, however, that neither Jew nor Arab has ever seen politics as a game of cricket. The British umpires found opponents who could make no compromise and would keep no promise. Since 1944, the British had faced a Jewish revolt in Palestine. The Jewish campaign was one of the most ruthless terrorist wars in history. British soldiers were kidnapped and murdered in grotesque so-called executions. Enormous bombs were planted in the heart of Palestine's cities. It was a war which brought Britain nothing but criticism throughout the world, particularly in the pro-Zionist USA. The horrors of the Nazi genocide gave Jewish demands a new, irresistible moral strength. The British said that their promise to establish a home for the Jewish nation was not the same as establishing a Jewish state. They tried to be impartial and, to appease Arab fears, attempted to limit Jewish immigration. Ships carrying Jewish migrants to Palestine were intercepted by the Royal Navy. Survivors of the Nazi death camps found themselves behind British barbed wire in prison camps in Cyprus or even Mauritius in the far Indian Ocean. The British were baffled why British-educated, westernized Arab leaders could not find common ground with others of good sense and reason, educated, sophisticated European and American-born Jews. In 1947, the new United Nations tried to broker a settlement acceptable to both sides. The UN suggested an Arab state and a Jewish state would exist alongside each other. A micro-territory in British hands would control the holy site of Jerusalem. Once more, no one would move a millimeter towards each other. In December 1947, Britain, exhausted by the whole situation, like another earlier imperial governor in Jerusalem, washed their hands of these people. In just 4 months, every British soldier was gone. Barely had their ships disappeared beneath the horizon than the different peoples of Palestine unlocked their stores of weapons. And on Palestine's borders, hostile Arab states stood to their arms. Zionists declared the State of Israel. A chapter of the British Empire closed, and a new story began. Britain presented their decision to leave India in the light of the white man's burden, telling themselves India had been brought to adult nationhood, ready for independence. The abandonment of Palestine, however, showed the world Britain would not fight to the death for the imperial principle. The end of empire in Palestine and in India set the course of the British Empire's fall. Mistakes made, which Britain would not repeat. Lessons learnt that showed the way to leave the empire with dignity, leave the colonies in good order. At the very start of the 20th century, a bitter war was fought in South Africa between the Boers, the Afrikaners, colonists of Dutch descent, and the British Empire. Since British victory in 1901, an uneasy tension had existed between the two European cultures. Of course, the British believed themselves superior to African people. But equally, they held that subject peoples deserved fair treatment and be offered the benefits of British civilization through education and investment. This contrasted sharply with the Boers' stern fundamentalist religious belief in themselves as a people chosen by God, and South Africa as their promised land. It was a history mixed with mythology, which the Afrikaner kept alive, and which divided South Africans of Boer and British tradition. South Africa was a dominion of the empire, an independent nation, not a colony. It had answered the call for help of the extended British family in 2 world wars, but was free to make its own way in the world. In 1948, a long-term coalition between Boer and British broke apart, and a new nationalist government came to power that was Afrikaner-dominated. South Africa stepped out of the timeline of the history of the British Empire and began to make its own unique story as it drafted the first laws of apartheid. Imperialists believed in the white man's burden, that Britain had a duty to improve, educate, and civilize territories they believed they held in trust. Wherever the British went, they brought law and order. Whatever the right or wrong of one people ruling another, it is undeniable that the British imperial government imposed a rule fairer, more just, and more benign to the ordinary man and woman than any it replaced. The post-war British government saw itself as building a brand, bright, shiny new nation. When this Britain looked at the empire after India, it came to see a new white man's burden. The empire was now to be developed and planned in the same way as the new Britain. There was to be a new empire of prosperity and progress, based on science and technology, led by men in white coats, not red. An empire where the columns of bulldozers replaced that of soldiers, where tractors replaced battleships. Britain became the builder of power stations, roads, schools, new mines, and new factories. Some ambitious projects, now with hindsight, border on the absurd. There was a grand plan to bring sheep rearing to New Guinea, transplanting an entirely new way of life to one of the empire's simplest peoples. There was the groundnut scheme for East Africa, plans to mass-produce eggs in the Gambia, and to turn the Atlantic island of St. Helena into a giant sugar beet field. Every one of these schemes failed. Instead of attending grand durbars, where native rulers pledged feudal loyalty, Britain's royal family now visited model exhibitions of development. The message of progress was always underlined by the contrasting inclusion of a traditional native village. Newsreels showed Africans earnestly bent over machine tools and leading in prime beef on the hoof, as if in an English country fair. Some old imperialists hoped Africa would become a new India, that an African army might be raised to replace the Indian. This was a dream that was to be dashed. Hand in hand with the transfer of wealth and knowledge, the empire began to transfer political power. The empire gradually granted internal self-government to individual colonies in a step-by-step, colony-by-colony process to bring independence. The empire was to be gradually replaced by the Commonwealth, an extended family of British civilization based around the former colonies. Independent nations joined together by history, kin, and friendship. This simply extended the idea of the empire dominions, such as Australia and Canada, which had been independent for nearly a century. In Nigeria, elections were held to create a parliament to gradually take control of Nigerian internal affairs and lead to a shadow government that would eventually rule an independent country. All Nigerians, black and white, could vote. The British created an unspoken formula for the peaceful end of empire. Nationalist leaders, usually educated in British universities, often spent some time in prison for sedition. Then they would be released to conduct negotiations with the British. They would win an election organised on British lines, sit in a parliament organised as the British in Westminster, and end up shaking hands with the departing British governor. It is to the credit of the British Empire that its fall was so unremarkable. In newsreel after newsreel, scenes of traditional dancing are followed by minor royalty handing over power, then fireworks as the Union Jack came down. Violent uprising was to be the exception. In those colonies where violence arose, it was because Britain wished to avoid a communist revolution or seizure of power by a violent minority within a colony. Britain sought the creation of states in its own image. The British way of quitting empire was not the only way a European empire could choose. If we, in the present, seek to judge the British, we should look at the sad history of other European empires. France fought bitter wars to hold what she had. 90,000 French died trying to keep Vietnam. In Algeria, a war of independence brought France to the edge of revolution. Belgium fought desperately to hold the Congo. Portugal fought into the 1970s to keep parts of Africa Portuguese. The British did fight a series of little wars to ensure democracy in their ex-colonies. The word war, though, was not used. These conflicts were called emergencies and police actions. When China fell to Mao Zedong in 1949, communist revolutionaries all over Southeast Asia found a new source of support and a new channel by which aid could flow from the Soviet Union. In the jungles of Malaya, guerrillas attempted to overthrow the imperialists and establish a communist government, just as the forces of communist leader Ho Chi Minh had done in Vietnam. The Malayan emergency has been called Britain's Vietnam War. This was a war which the British conclusively and decisively won, defeating the communists and establishing an independent state of Malaysia that grew into an Asian tiger economy. Britain won in Malaya because it was a colonial war in which the professional British army traditionally excelled. The British were ruthless, as an army with a tradition of volunteer professionalism rather than reluctant conscription can be. The Chinese minority in Malaya, the population which most supported the communists, were rounded up and interned in concentration camps. The British were fortunate. Their Vietnam was fought before the time when television could report all that an army did. Britain won in Malaya because they had clear, focused aims, which France and later America in Vietnam lacked. Britain fought a sophisticated political war, convincing the Malayan people that it was their war, that Britain fought for Malayan independence. This policy of development and a gradual release of power with limited use of force would have provided a peaceful and smooth fall of the British Empire, had the empire been the same thing everywhere in the world. While countries such as Nigeria, Ghana, and so many of Britain's African colonies moved on a steady timetable towards an independence that was remarkable in its routine, where the aims of the new Britain clashed with the extended white family of nations, where large settler populations existed, this transition from empire could be painful. In Kenya, Britain became involved in a difficult war, again called an emergency. The enemy were Kikuyu resistance fighters under the name of the Mau Mau. Mau Mau had political aims, led by the Western-educated Jomo Kenyatta. Mau Mau was also a secret society, bound by traditional African magic and ritual. Kenya was not like Malaya, not as foreign. It was not hostile desert, nor steamy, unhealthy jungle. Kenya had good European-style farmland and a climate Europeans found comfortable. Kenya had a large, prosperous community of white farmers, a community of robust, high-spirited individuals, buccaneering ex-soldiers, the younger children of British aristocrats. The lifestyle was relaxed and uninhibited. London newspapers reported the sexual lives of white Kenyans as salacious scandal. The Mau Mau were violent and committed horrifying, murderous attacks on their enemies. The Mau Mau were the worst nightmare of the white settlers. It seemed an old, primeval Africa was bursting from a heart of darkness to take away all they cherished. The settlers had dreamed of somehow stemming the flow of history surging through Africa to keep their good life, ruling as a tiny elite over docile Africans, happy as servants. In fact, few whites were killed by the Mau Mau. The emergency was more a war fought amongst the Kikuyu tribe. Much of the fighting was by British-trained Kenyans. The The British were ruthless in dealing with the Mau Mau. They used their favourite weapon, the concentration camp, in which 150,000 suspected Mau Mau were interned. 12,000 suspects were tried and imprisoned. 150 Mau Mau were hanged, 430 shot while escaping. It was a one-sided war. The Mau Mau had too few arms and were too few to ever defeat the British. The Mau Mau did not enjoy the support of the majority of Africans. But the white Kenyans were small in number, and the Mau Mau emergency made them realize they must go with the current of history. Kenya became independent in 1963, with Mau Mau leader Kenyatta as Prime Minister. It's a strange fact that by the 1950s, many British colonialists, be they settlers with homes and businesses, or administrators who spent their working lives overseas, now believed in a Britishness that no longer existed. The colonials seemed more British than the real British. The Britain these people called home was a Britain that was becoming more American. The Britain of teddy boys and teenagers with new music and culture. A Britain losing respect for the Crown, Church and Empire. A Britain that was gaining a black immigrant population of its own. In 1956, a speech by British Prime Minister Anthony Eden is interrupted by a member of the Empire Loyalist League, demanding that he should not betray the Empire. Those in power knew Britain no longer had the guns, the ships, or the men to support an empire. Those who saw the ferment of articulate African opinion sweeping that continent knew an era was ending. Most of Britain's people were indifferent. The Empire Loyalists belonged to the eccentric fringe of politics. Indeed, it was a feature of the Empire's fall that it rarely divided Britain. Eden played a central role in the closing acts of Britain's great imperial drama. Eden was cultured and educated, a product of the public school Eton and Oxford University. He had been brought up to be a master of empire. For too long, he had stood at Churchill's shoulder. He had been a key part of the government that had led the British Empire in its finest hour, in the defeat of Nazism. Eden knew that Britain could not rule millions of other people forever, yet he believed Britain still a great power. He believed in an older sort of imperialism, that even if Britain was unable to impose direct rule, it could still impose its will on other nations by force if needed. It was Eden's fate to lead the last war of Britain as a great power, and to unwittingly lead Britain's people to realize how far Britain had fallen. The story began in Egypt in the early 1950s. Egypt was one of the empire's most troublesome possessions. British and Egyptian had complete contempt and hatred for each other, a rare state of affairs in the British Empire. Egypt was supposedly independent, with its own government and armed forces, but in fact was ruled by Britain. Egypt was important because of the Suez Canal. Through the canal passed the empire's trade. Through the canal passed battleships of the Royal Navy. Britain had always defended the Great Waterway. It was for the canal that Egypt was taken from Turkey in the 19th century. The great desert battles of World War II were fought to keep the canal from German hands. More than 60,000 British troops guarded Suez. In 1952, young, militant and nationalist Egyptian army officers seized power in Cairo. Prominent among them was Gamal Nasser. Loathing Britain for its failed promises to the Arabs over Palestine, they wanted an end to Britain in Egypt, and fighting broke out between British and Egyptian. America at first wanted Britain to hold its Egyptian bases, to threaten Russia with nuclear attack. In 1952, these were no longer needed, and America's priority was to prevent Egypt falling to Soviet influence. It was agreed that the British would leave Egypt over the next 4 years. Nasser, a man of incredible charisma and passion, poured forth a torrent of hatred towards Britain. Nasser wanted to unite all Arab peoples. He branded as stooges all Britain's friends in the Middle East, the Saudis, the Jordanians, and the traditional Arab monarchies. He attempted to destabilize these countries, undermining their governments. Eden saw Nasser as a new Mussolini who had to be stopped before the whole Middle East plunged into war. In 1956, Nasser nationalized the canal to pay for a new dam to be built on the Nile at Aswan, replacing a structure built by Britain. Eden saw this as his Munich and resolved Nasser must be toppled. A complex plot was formed with France and Israel. Israel invaded Egypt. Britain and France attacked. Their claimed objective was to bring peace and protect the canal. Their real goal was Nasser's removal. Britain was condemned by the world as an aggressor. As British forces came ashore in Egypt, Soviet troops machine-gunned the people of Hungary as they tried to throw off communism. America condemned Britain for destroying the credibility of the free world. The streets of London filled with protests by ordinary people, disgusted at Britain's actions. A currency crisis needed American help to prevent British economic collapse. Britain was forced to withdraw, and Eden fell from office. Suez removed any doubts that Britain was no longer a great imperial power. Eden's successor, Harold Macmillan, defined both the spirit of these times and Britain's new realism when visiting South Africa in 1960. Before the entire South African government, he said, "The wind of change is blowing through this continent." He urged South Africa to join with the rest of Britain's family and abandon its policy of racial apartheid. South Africa elected to keep its chosen path. Months after Macmillan's speech, the South African police killed 56 demonstrators at Sharpeville. Soon after, African leader Nelson Mandela would begin his long imprisonment. Britain was faced with violent opposition as the Mediterranean island of Cyprus sought independence. Cyprus was an unasked-for addition to the empire that became a base to further guard the Suez Canal. Cyprus had been added to the empire in the 19th century. A popular song refrained, "Here's another little island that our queen has got, even though she has already, really, quite a lot." Once more, Britain ruled a population bitterly divided. In Cyprus, the division was between Greek and Turkish Cypriots. Greek Cypriots demanded union with Greece and fought a terrorist war of assassination and bombing against the British. In 1960, an uneasy compromise was brokered by the British between the two factions. It was a legacy that was not to last, and today the island is divided in two armed camps. Parts of Cyprus remain to this day tiny pieces of British territory, and British soldiers still march in Cyprus. Not all Britain's colonies wanted independence. The people of the Mediterranean island fortress of Malta actually voted to become united with Britain. Malta and Britain shared a long history. The island was the second home of the Royal Navy. Britain rejected the Maltese and gave the island its independence in 1964. In the 1960s, the last chapter of the British Empire's fall would be written in Africa. In southern Rhodesia, a small population of white settlers ruled over many more black Africans. Rhodesia was a self-governing colony, allowed considerable freedom in running its own affairs. Power was wholly in the hands of the white minority. The new empire of progress, of an evolving commonwealth based on democracy, collided head-on with the old imperial idea of a family of British civilizations. The formula to end empire, which Britain used all over Africa and would have seen an elected black government take power, failed in Rhodesia. The white population rebelled, declaring their independence and determination to run their country in their way. The Rhodesian rebels embodied the extended British family. Their leader, Ian Smith, had been a fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain, defending England's skies as his skies. Britain's government proved powerless to enforce its will. The leaders of Black Africa demanded Britain use armed force. Rhodesia divided Britain. For every Briton that condemned the British government for not using force, another condemned that same government for betrayal of family. A succession of talks between Britain and its rebel colony, held on warships in the Mediterranean, failed to bring compromise. The end of Rhodesia's story, how it became modern Zimbabwe, was not written until the 1980s, when a new order swept through all of southern Africa. The story of the British Empire's fall began in the reign of Queen Empress Victoria, in a time remembered in flickering and ghostly monochrome. In less than a human life, the Queen Emperor's great-great-grandchildren presided over the last rites of the empire in an age of colour, as state after state was born to make its own choices and its own way in the world. The Britain of 1910 taught its children to colour the map of the world red and to be proud of their small country's dominion over a global empire. It was a supremely confident nation that believed it was natural for one people to rule another. 21st century children learn about a different world, one which believes in the basic human right of peoples to choose their government. History usually teaches the fall of empires to be progressive changes for the better. To walk through the streets of London is to walk in the presence of imperial history, surrounded by evidence of all that imperial Britain was. The true memorials to Britain's empire are not carved in stone. Rather, they stand in the minds of the men and women the empire created. The final act of the Boer War was played out before the world when, in 1990, a black African, Nelson Mandela, became president of South Africa. Mandela once said, "I was brought up in a British school. Britain was the home of everything best in the world, and I have not discarded the influence of Britain and British history and culture." It is in the lives and ideas of people such as Mandela and Gandhi, people whom the empire created, that the true monuments to the empire are found. Britain's empire made those people who brought about its end, arming them with ideas, arming them with a way of seeing the world as it could be, as it should be. Mohandas Gandhi believed imperialism the ultimate glorification of violence. Empires are built by violence and force, and it is by violence and force that empires are usually, ultimately, brought to ruin. But despite the little wars, the grand story of the end of the British Empire is not one of violence, of defeat, ruin, chaos, or anarchy. It is a history of peaceful transition. Britain's was an empire that knew its time was gone. The British Empire is the greatest that history has ever known. The British Empire's greatest gift to the world, to history, and to the future, is that its like will never be seen again.